So I don't want to waste time. We will get to the minor controversy, but then deal with the more major X-Men controversy, which I think is much more interesting. So essentially, geeks and gamers are complaining, as they usually do, about the MCU. Actually, I'm fairly indifferent to what the hell they're saying, but I want to be accurate that the focus of the video began with one place, but then moved into another, exposing just how stupid Jeremy is.
Out of plain Sentry in Marvel Studios' Thunderbolts movie. Now, Stephen Yeun, Glenn from Walking Dead, probably what he's best known for, when people recognize him for most. He was set to play a race swap version of Sentry. That is no.
Well, again, I may get some people who think I'm going to defend the MCU at all levels. I don't think they even bothered to look at my content. I'm fairly critical. I'm not really excited for the Thunderbolts. This casting issue doesn't really affect me. I'm like, eh. The comic book was actually pretty strong. I only read a few of the issues, but the storytelling was very, very strong. But apparently they're not really going to do anything with that, so don't really care. But I will be open-minded. Maybe they will do things to persuade me. But then Jeremy, as usual, can't stop being stupid and be like, all right, well, that wasn't really an interesting interpretation, but it wasn't a bad interpretation. Kind of just in the middle. No, he has to take the extra step and try to show off and say, I don't even understand this. Why do we need that Asian? Don't we already have the diversities? Look at the ex-manos. And you're like, huh. But then he said something very critical, and you listen closely, listen several times, you're like, that is shockingly stupid. I mean, like, even for Geeks and Gamers, like, that is flat out not true. You don't know anything.
The X-Men were the biggest group, biggest comic, in the industry, most prominent characters. Wolverine was kind of the king. He was the most popular character, but you had this whole universe of people. And anybody that grew up on X-Men, whether it's comics or, the cartoons or whatever, when you hear this nonsense about diversity, and you're like, well, not that I ever thought about it as a fan, because I didn't, but like you look back on it now because it's such a prominent word, and you're like, well, the X-Men were always diverse as hell.
Well, what did he say that was so shocking? Well, listen closely, because he said it, and he never took it back. In fact, he kind of doubled down on it, and you're like, huh?
That I ever thought about it as a fan, because I didn't, but like you look back on it now because it's such a prominent word, and you're like, well, the X-Men were always diverse as hell. You know what I mean? And that was never really a problem. But then you hear these Marvel.
Well, the most generous interpretation, and I'm being very, very generous, is probably what Jeremy means is the X-Men animated series and even the X-Men comics from the 1990s. But even knowing a little bit about the X-Men, and how does he not know this? The X-Men didn't begin in the 1990s. They had comic books before the 1990s. And again, I'm being very, very generous. But you can't say the X-Men were always diverse, because the initial team was not that. I mean, it was pretty white. That's not something you can really dispute. That was there from the beginning. So what does he mean the X-Men were always diverse? Always means always, so he can't mean always. He probably meant X-Men from the 1990s, but then if he said that, he'd be exposed, because he'd be like, oh, okay, well, that's not bad. I looked at the cartoon from the 1990s. I read the comics from the 1990s. But here's the thing. I read before the 1990s. I read the X-Men comics from the 1980s. I've even read some comics from the 1970s. I don't claim to be a full expert on every X-Men issue, but on the X-Men, I do know a huge amount of the history. I read the X-Men, I read the X-Factor, I read the X-Force, I read Cable, and I could even go through very detailed summaries and analyses just from my memory. I don't even have to look at my comics to refresh myself. I can show people the comics I read. I could go through it page by page. I definitely knew the comics existed before the 1990s, and saying factually, well, they were always diverse. They had tons of the blacks and the gays, even in the early 60s. That is not true. The comics did not start off diverse with the X-Men. That is simply not true. You simply don't know the X-Men. You should just state up front, now I don't really know the X-Men. I don't really know the Marvel comics. I really don't know anything. My name is Jeremiah. But of course he can't say that. He's just going to keep pretending like I know my X-Men. I love the X-Men. We all loved the X-Men. We saw the cartoons, and they were very diverse. True, but there was a time before the animated series of the 1990s. I don't know. Start doing some reading, Jeremy. Please.